Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the end of neoliberalism. And as those of you who were here early will have noticed, as in probably pretty much every revolution in human history, the women were here first, and the men came along late. And you can also, when people ask you, where were you when neoliberalism ended, you will know that it happened in a dark, dingy nightclub somewhere in Brighton. So welcome to this afternoon. Welcome to our guests who are going to help us explore neoliberalism, what it is, what it was, when it ended, and what we can do to hasten its demise and fight off the challenge to neoliberalism, surprisingly in some respects from the right. So with us to help us explore that this afternoon are Paul Mason, journalist, broadcaster, most recently for Channel 4, who has broken free of the shackles of the institution, author, documentary maker and playwright. We have Jo Littler, an academic who has explored the cultures of consumption and meritocracy. She's the author of Against Meritocracy, which shows the way in which meritocracy is actually anything but a system of merit as it privileges power, and hopefully she's going to delve into that a bit more for us later. Valerie Alzaga works with organised labour and migrant rights. She works with, really, I guess, the people who are on the blunt end of the neoliberal system, the most precarious, the people who the neoliberal system sees to be disposable. So we will be hearing a lot, I think, from Valerie about how we can organise better. And Clive Lewis, MP for Norwich. That is, he couldn't be here with us today, so we've got Clive. He's one of the more thoughtful and engaged voices on the left, I think. And in terms of his thoughts on neoliberalism, he famously tweeted, I think famously, in the aftermath of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, burn neoliberalism, not people. So what I'm gonna, hands up who is confident they've got a clear definition of neoliberalism? Whoa, maybe 3, 4 people in the audience? Okay, we're gonna come back to that at the end. But for now, I am going to invite our panel to explore, see if we can get together to a definition of neoliberalism. This idea, and I'm going to preempt them slightly by saying I think it's the idea that markets have the answer to absolutely every aspect of human life, and that as individuals, groups, and nations, we succeed or fail in some sort of atomized vacuum where history, power, and privilege are entirely absent. Now, the cracks in that system are widening, and an increasing number of people are beginning to look through the breach and catch a glimpse of the world beyond. But as with the collapse of any ideology, it's not simple and it's not clear. So perhaps by better understanding it, we can better move beyond it. With the simple caveat, I think, that the last thing we need to replace any totalising system of the way that the world works is another totalising system. So we're looking for a range of ways of understanding the world rather than a single one. And I'm going to start by asking Paul to explain what he thinks neoliberalism is, how it took hold, and what we can do to break free in 5 minutes or less.
So there's a semantic point, and that is neoliberalism was a set of ideas and we can discuss where they came from and how they developed in history. But I don't use the word neoliberalism primarily to describe that, because I don't trust ideas to describe reality. In addition, the other source of free market economics, which has not been well understood until the end, is ordoliberalism, which is the German version of free market economics, which was much earlier built into the German system. So we can talk in a bit about what the ideas are, but in my book Post-Capitalism, to the annoyance of the Adam Smith Institute, I treat neoliberalism as an objective system, as a fact, as a collection of facts that has defined the last 30 or 40 years. In addition, by describing what we could call it the neoliberal system or the neoliberal model, for me, it doesn't matter whether whether country A does this part of the division of labor and country B another. In this sense, you could say, well, America's the archetypal neoliberal country, or Singapore. But for me, China, Germany, Japan, the so-called mercantilist states, the states that didn't do a lot of free market economics, are also part of the neoliberal system. So that's by way of not so much a definition, because I don't want to annoy Chris Leslie, who says Marxism's got no place in the Labour Party. But my way of thinking is to not go for static definitions, and instead to study things in their as beginning, middle, and an end, in their organic existence. And so neoliberalism is a total system. It's the world system. It's not primarily for me a set of ideas, although it was created as ideas. That's why when right-wingers say neoliberalism, it's thrown around like a bloody insult, that's my answer. I'm simply describing reality. You could call it Norman, if you want, or Nigel, or Adolf, or any of those other names that have gone out of fashion. But you've got to call it something. Right. In what time I've got left, I will then say what I think it is. Will Davis from Goldsmiths University came up with a brilliant definition, even though I'm not into definitions. It's the disenchantment of politics by economics. That is, it's the reduction of everything as a system, not as simply as an ideology, as a system, to market dynamics now, coercively. And this is the important thing. Right back at the origins of the there was a 1938 conference in Paris of the original thinkers, and Jacques Fourier was this French right-winger, said, look, it's not about laissez-faire. It's not about leave the market alone to set economic dynamics. Because he said, and Hayek says it the same, the market left to itself produces monopolies and state control, i.e. competition, as Karl Marx taught us, creates monopolies. So Fourier and all the founders of neoliberalism said, what we must do is coercively reinsert market forces at every opportunity wherever they result into consolidation. I would argue that from Thatcher onwards through to now, neoliberalism has been the coercive imposition of market relationships into all aspects of economic life. And by that, this is the other thing, we don't mean simply trading. For Adam Smith, market relationships are trading. I barter with you. I've got a nail, you've got a screw. Let's, use money to interchange. No. What neoliberalism did was redefine market relationships as primarily competition. And that's what explains when we all know about how they enforce market relationships into, for example, water. So you see Cochabamba in Bolivia, they privatize the water supply. The boss has to leave the city with his hard drive under his arm as the workers set fire to his office. That's a classic marketization of what was a natural resource. But there is also the imposition of competition into everything, so that everything has to have a metric. The human capital of Great Britain is measured by the World Economic Forum on a set of metrics that have nothing to do with the market. In other words, every part of our lives, and this is the final thing, including our thinking, is forced into individual competition against each other. In the process, the work I'm doing at the moment for my next book is all about how, not at the level of ideology, but at the level of enforced behavior and repetition patterns, neoliberalism from the 1970s onwards enforced this market-only, economics-only, competitiveness-only way of thinking into human life. And the archetypes are, the favela dweller, the favela dweller who lives in a factory that was once a factory in Rio de Janeiro. And the first thing that it happens is that all that's left is the residents' association. The factory's gone, the union's gone, the party's gone. The organised crime comes in, destroys the residents' association. What replaces it? The criminal gang. What do you do in a criminal gang? You get money, you avoid violence, and you look out for yourself. In country after country, in the 70s, that form of behaviour was imposed, including the town I come from, Lee in Lancashire, many small towns in Britain, you've seen this. They're rife with organised crime and individuality, competition, dog eat dog. That's phase one of neoliberalism, but it was, I think, by Thatcher and Reagan, who pioneered it, thought of as a way through which the Western countries could dominate the world. And as they were ripping up our social fabric in Britain, they were ripping open the markets of Latin America to enforce financial logic into them, enforcing wave after wave of poverty, austerity, and financial crisis. But then an accident happens. We call it an accident. It was accidental, and they destroyed the Soviet Union. And once you get the doubling of the workforce, the opening up of what was 15 to 20% of the global economy, the neoliberalism as a method for extracting value out of the global south became a more objective method, I would argue, for extracting value globally on behalf of an increasingly global ruling class. It hits problems because, very, very briefly, that division of labour between producing and consuming countries, borrowing and lending countries, which we call the global imbalances, capital flowed around the world necessarily in a way that created a series of financial bubbles. The Asian crisis, the long-term capital management in Russia, then the dot-com boom, then the subprime boom. We get one after the other, financial boom bust. And the only cure for financial boom bust was Lehman. The only way that the imbalance between China, Britain, Germany and Greece could be sorted was if the financial system blew up, and it did. So since 2008, I think there's been a third phase of neoliberalism in which it's been a zombie on life support. But to finish here, if you accept my definition of it as an essentially state coercion of market forces, and it has to go on relentlessly, see it now in the Tory party, what then happens is that around about 2012, 2014, individual national elites go, it's not working as a global system, let's carry on imposing the market forces nationally in the same old way, and screw everybody else. So if you like, Jacob Rees-Mogg is a national neoliberal. Donald Trump is a national-centered neoliberal. They are not returning to Keynesian state economic nationalism. They're simply trying to pursue the disenchantment of politics by economics, the coercive insertion of market forces and competition on a national level to their own benefit. And in other words, they now accept that what was a positive-sum game when neoliberalism was growing, you move your factory offshore, Chinese goods become cheaper, you get a cheap plastic, kid's toy. That's the kind of circle of benefit of neoliberalism. Now, the idea is, if you move my industry offshore, then my country's done, that's to the detriment of us. So you get all these national versions of neoliberalism, and I think that that's the next phase. Of course, the problem is, it's all underpinned, we'll come back to this, by the sources of growth that were driving neoliberalism were not primarily technological innovation, I would argue, at all. The Bank of England's got good evidence on this. They were primarily population expansion, some improvements in technology, but population expansion and the catch-up of countries like China, Latin America, to the levels of others. Once that runs out, you've only got technological change to drive growth, and the current problem neoliberalism faces, as everybody seeks a national solution to the crisis, is that there's nothing really driving growth.
Thanks. It's great to be here. So what is neoliberalism? Well, I would say it's got three main aspects. Firstly, it involves what Wendy Brown, the political theorist, calls the disemboweling of the social, or the dismantling of collective provision like comprehensive schools, NHS, public libraries, national parks. So the destruction of systems and zones which put care, nurture and health first, that we all share and which are for common use. So that's my kind of first plank. The second one would be that neoliberalism is a process which very actively uses the machinery of power, whether that's the state or kind of international organisations like the IMF, to privatise those zones, those structures, those public spaces, and to force through competitive corporate markets and increase the wealth of the 1%, creating a kind of gold rush for the already rich, shafting the rest of us and wrecking their natural world. And then thirdly, the third plank, I think, is, as Paul referred to, it's a kind of ideology, but also a system of governance, which tells us that we are fundamentally, and more than anything else, competitive individuals. It's a worldview which says life mainly involves looking after yourself, your own self-interest. It involves climbing the ladder and elbowing other people out of the way. So that's where meritocracy comes in, this idea that is kind of a really important fig leaf, I think, for plutocracy and the kind of power grab that's going on, which says all you have to do is activate talent, activate your talent, and you too can succeed, and if you fail, it's your fault. So neoliberalism is a series of practices and processes that are always incomplete, whilst being completely damaging. It's a kind of ideology and a sensibility that shapes our sense of what's normal and what's possible, that gets into the nooks and crannies of our everyday life. And I think all that together forms a kind of assemblage and network of power, which is turbocharging inequality and destroying the environment that we all depend on. Thinking about where it came from, there are lots of different phases you could draw from. There's no single originary moment. So, as has been mentioned, we could cite the German ordo-liberals who reacted to Nazism by reacting against the state, but also using it to try and push through new forms of market competition. Or the kind of early Chicago boys that were reacting against the New Deal to try and inflate the power of corporations. And the kind of transnational connections between them, such as kind of most famously the Mont Pelerin Society meeting after the Second World War. There's also other events before the war. When effectively they were a kind of bunch of cranks and losers and outsiders who had to spend years kind of making connections, forming links between people, trying to build up their power, build up their influence, build up their lobbying and their kind of bases and reserves of power. For years before that came to fruition, in the 70s in Chile, when a democratically socialist president was ousted with CIA money. In Britain, when the then Labour government at the time kind of compromised with the IMF and massive cuts to public services happened, which spawned the wave of strikes. And in New York, when the banks said we're not going to sustain the debts, and so things like university tuition fees came in there. So there's kind of the different phases of it. I think since then, as people like Naomi Klein have documented so well, neoliberalism, this assembly just kind of worked to seize any crisis, or what Homer Simpson would call a kind of crisis opportunity, to increase its power, to kind of push through the interests of the 1% and to kind of deepen this very ingrained psychosocial logic of individualism and competition, that we have to brand ourselves, we have to hustle, and if we fail, it's just down to us.
I'm just going to invite Valerie to explain a little bit what neoliberalism means in the workplace.
Yeah. So, from a worker point of view, and I think all of us, or most of us, are workers or have been workers, right? I mean, it's been quite a violent change, right? And it's important because as you're talking very macro, right? I mean, the transformations in labor have been twofold. One has been really the defunding, right? I mean, I work for the public sector union. The defunding of what all those jobs that were the social nets and the social safety net for all of us. there has been a very systematic defunding process, right? Which is not just privatization, right? It's tax evasion, it's tax cuts, it's subsidies, it's debt and an engineering of the finances in order to figure out how to keep sucking money out of us, out of taxpayers, out of quality care, out of every service we need and we also need to provide as workers, right? So the kind of like engineering of the economics of how that's done, right? I mean, I work in social care. Right now we have equity funds buying social care companies, right? And actually peeling off the pieces that are profitable, selling the ones that are not, keeping real estate, and then actually turning around and re-renting that to city councils for triple or double the price, right? So there is mechanizations of how this defunding is happening, right? Debt is another one. Right? If I go into debt, then obviously I'm paying into finance some kind of credit percentage, right? Regressive taxations on the young people, right? If I make you go into debt, as a worker, the first thing that you need to think about is paying that debt. Not what is going on in my workplace, do I have the right to form a union, right? So I also think they'll get mechanically how they've defunded the workplace has been extremely smart. And we are dealing with an elite that is extremely smart. They have an agenda and they have names. And we need to be very smart about who these perpetrators are. And thus, we in the workplace, as well as in the social movement and political space, we need to kind of also understand what's happening in the workplace, right? So what does it mean to be privatized? What does it mean to be subcontracted, outsourced? Well, it means that you're removed from the source of that income or that money. Removed from rights, because when I outsource you and unions don't do their job of following those workers, right, which is part of the work we need to do as trade unions, means that those outsourced and privatized workers are never going to know a union. And if they are trying to form a union, they are going to get completely crushed, right? Because who has control of that privatized employer space is the privatized employer, right? In a public sector, presumably there is a social pact. The unions are accepted, there is branches, etc., etc. But in the privatized world, that's not how it is. So I spend a lot of time actually trying to organize the most precarious workers in social care, in cleaning, all the stuff that is outsourced, and just having the right to organize is a huge obstacle, right? The power is simply being devoided, and the same thing. You're competing, you're under somebody's really tight management line. And unions are actually crushed. And so that we need to understand. The culture in the workplace is not, it's not a place where we democratically choose, right, to unionize and fight. This is what's happening. This is what we need to fight. I would also argue that, for me, it's been very interesting because there is a narrative, right, that Reagan and Thatcher started, which is, government is too fat, workers in the public sector are too fat, right? They began blaming the defunding that they're trying to actually impose on all of us on the workers, on the actual public sector. And they pinpointed the public sector workers against the service users, right? It's either the service or actually the public sector salary. And they actually pointed us against each other, not understanding that workers are the community. We're also the people that take our children to school, and we're also the community that actually needs these services. And we've bought into that idea. And unfortunately, part of the conversation now is how do we take the narrative to another space? Where has the money gone? How do we follow it, right? Who has it? Because it's definitely not nurses that have been capped. It's definitely not these cleaners, and it's definitely, for hell, it's not social care workers. So in that sense, I think for me, what is interesting is also this narrative has made workers think that there is a limit, that we don't have, in a way to get this money because there is no money, right? Because it's being actually sucked, vacuumed out by all this financialization. And so how do we kind of think about that culture that keeps us kind of thinking that there is no way of doing that keeps us isolated and in a way competing with each other, right? And I do think that that's part of the work we need to do. The hope that we need to bring, right, is that there is another way. And we'll talk about what that is, but in my view, organizing rights, labor rights have to be front center of our struggle. Front center of our struggle, right? Because in a lot of ways, and not only, I mean, there's housing rights, there's other rights, but I do think fundamentally we take unions and labor for granted, and we cannot and we should not. We need to revive that, and I'm just happy to be here to have that conversation, so thank you.
So we've heard about neoliberalism as a description of a lived reality. We've heard about it from a cultural perspective. We've heard about what it means for workers and the people on the blunt end. But I'm also coming to Clive, last but not least, and interested in it as a political project. It's perhaps an apocryphal story, but Margaret Thatcher famously remarked when asked what her biggest success was, she replied, Tony Blair and New Labour. So I guess it's kind of what I'm interested in is how neoliberalism came to capture the left and how the left is breaking free and why that matters.
That's no mean feat. So I come to this as someone, I studied economics at university, and bizarrely enough, I never once heard the word, I can't remember the word neoliberalism used in the whole 3 years that I was being taught. And there was at no point was it ever explained to me that the kind of the economics that I was being taught was underpinned by neoliberal ideology. So I came through thinking this was economics. This was a broad-based economics curriculum, giving me a kind of wide definition of how the economy works and how things operate. But then about 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to attend a new economics foundation summer school on neoliberalism. Don't know why, it was very fortuitous, but I went along to it. And the only thing I can say is that it felt like I'd actually been deprogrammed. And my housemates were saying to me when I came back, it's like you've joined a fucking cult. You won't stop talking about neoliberalism. And it's true, I was, talking about it on my cornflakes, I was on the phone, I was neoliberalism, this, do you know that? And so it was a real eye-opener for me. And consequently, one of the key things I took away from that summer school was just how all-pervasive its ability was to basically imprison our minds as much as our economic outlook. That's what it does. It really narrows down your ability to see outside. It was like a mirror had been shattered. It's like the film when you've got the red pill, the blue pill, the Matrix. And I feel like I took the blue pill, I think, anyway. But it felt like a Matrix moment. And so it really opened my mind up. And when I got to Parliament, I got into a Labour Party, a new Labour Party, with a capital N. And whenever I mentioned the word neoliberalism, basically a klaxon would go off and a tin hat would descend upon my head. Quite literally, you were laughed at. If you used the term neoliberalism, it was literally something that you were a tin hat wearer. And that was within the Labour Party. And look, I think for the Labour Party, for social democracy, not just in this country, but across Europe, it was captured by these ideas. And I think you have to look back a little bit to kind of Hayek and the others, when the Montpellier set and so on, when they were talking about how do we germinate neoliberalism into wider society. And there's a story that was raised at the summer school, which is where a Conservative MP came to Hayek in the 50s and said, I love your work. I want to kind of set up a party, not to set up a party, but I want to make this part of the Conservative Party. I want it to underpin what we're about. And he said, I'm not interested. He said, I've got it. There's a longer term program. He wanted to set up the Chicago School. He wanted to go into the very institutions that in the post-war period had bought into the kind of the welfare state, had bought into that kind of social democratic consensus that lasted up until Thatcher and Reaganism. And he wanted to basically destroy it from within. The institutions, the academics, the universities, civil society. And he understood, many of them understood, that you couldn't make this a lasting economic philosophy that would bed in unless you could do that. And that's what they went about, and that's what they did. And consequently, by Barry Goldwater, arguably in the 1960s, and Thatcher and Reagan later on, he basically underpinned the whole of that neoliberal philosophy. They'd underpinned it, and it became the de facto realpolitik of the world. And unfortunately, we understand now, it was the end of history. Neoliberalism was the kind of high point of human economic evolution. There was no alternative. And social democratic parties brought into that. You know, and that's what the Labour Party did. It's what the SPD has done. And we can see the consequences. We look at Greece. We look at the 2008 crash. We look at the lack of solidarity in Europe, which is something we might come down to in a minute. But that's ultimately the consequence of what has happened. And I understand, you know, it's easy for us to sit here with hindsight, which does give you 20/20 vision, and to say Blair and Brown were so wrong. Well, they were wrong, and we do have hindsight. But actually, I think the scope within which they embraced intellectually and politically that project, that I think is unforgivable, especially the way that it ended up. And that's, I think, when I got into the Labour Party, the PLP in 2015, there were a very small handful of us, only a handful of us, that were actually prepared to stand up and understood, I think, kind of the underpinnings of what was going on, what 2008 meant. And obviously there are people who've been around a lot longer than me, like Jeremy and John MacDonald, who knew very well what this was about. They've been leading the struggle against it for 30 years. I was still in diapers when those two were up to that. So, you know, look, from my perspective, what's happened now is that, in part, you know, this is a hegemonic kind of philosophy. It has dominated, it did become, has become, and still is, to all intents and purposes, common sense. But it's now beginning to break down. 2008 and what's happened subsequently, Brexit included, what's happening with Trump, that is part of that narrative, part of that story. But I think now what we're seeing here, the world transformed. There are journalists from all around Europe that are coming in and saying, what are you guys getting right? How can we copy this? You guys seem to, the energy here is amazing. Well, that's got to be taken out around the rest of the country, because that's one of the things that Momentum has got to do. We've got to break down those barriers, got to make what we understand for a decent civilized society to be common sense. That's what they did, and that's the challenge for us.